I want to set the stage for our next presenter. I want you to imagine that you're a child, you're at home, you're watching television. You're watching one of the great technical achievements of all time, the Apollo mission. You're a child, you're watching it. You go outside and you look up in the stars. But you have no reason to believe that you could ever be an astronaut. Those aren't the cards you were offered. Those are barriers in the sky that you weren't invited to. But sometimes barriers are in the mind and not in the sky. And I want to introduce a video before I introduce someone that has had extraordinary accomplishments and is yet on day one of being heroic in terms of what he gives back to education. Let's run the video.
John Herrington, Mission Specialist number 2. And our first Native American in space. Go for main engine start. 1, and liftoff of Space Shuttle Endeavour. Another building block for the foundation of the International Space Station.
Mid-deck of Endeavour, Mission Specialist John Herrington, and joined just out of the field of view by Mike Lopez Alegria, his spacewalking partner for this flight, as they are in the midst of their work to check out the extravehicular mobility units, the spacesuits that they will wear.
Spacewalker John Herrington getting an early start on the cleanup activities for the end of the spacewalk.
That's a view you don't see every day.
You know, Walt Disney once said, "You dream it, you can do it." Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the ICTAM Disrupted 2019 stage. Someone that dreamed very big and did it, Commander John Herrington.
Tony, thank you. Thank you. Wow. Hey, good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Well, this is great. Thank you so much for having me here today. So I'm really honored to be here. Different things happen when I go to do presentations, and usually something happens during the day that just, it lights a light. And I want to share something before I start this. I finished my PhD a few years ago, and based on this conference, if I can pull it up here, I thought about my dissertation, and the very opening of my dissertation applies directly to this conference. If you don't mind, I'd like to read the introduction to that real quick. And I apologize, I don't have a slide, because I thought about this at the last minute, but I hope a few folks will recognize this. If I can bring it up, my eyesight. The other day, I read a statement to the effect that more than half of the working people in shops and factories in country today are working in industries that didn't even exist 40 years ago. It would seem to mean that as far as the working population is concerned, half of the old industries have gone into obsolescence and been replaced by new ones. The man who made that statement, a working scientist, pointed out that every worker in every industry today is doing what he's doing either directly or indirectly because of the progress that has been made in the last half century in the physical sciences. In other words, in the material world, in the world of production, of material commodities, of material entities, the progress of knowledge, of science, has revolutionized activity in the last 50 years. John Dewey said that in 1938. John Dewey's a big educator, right? That was the opening of my dissertation. I thought this is very applicable to what today is all about, so thank you for letting me read that. Let me get started with a few things. If I can bring it up here. Boo! There we go. I wanted to be cool when I was a little kid. I have the glasses. My brother's actually in that picture, but I took him out. He's on the side. The lithograph in my spacesuit, a young man goes, "That's not you. This guy's really young." Okay. The older guy's right there, me, and this is my rebellious look. I decided to try and grow a mustache and see what's happening. So the 60s a new 30. I'm a baby boomer. I always wanted to, I sat in a cardboard box when I was 8 years old and dreamed about going to the moon. And I never really thought of something I could accomplish until much later. So this is a story about that. The very first presentation I ever gave as an astronaut was to a group of about, maybe 15, 20 people, and I had a speech. We actually had a speech writer at NASA, and she would quote Chaucer and Walden and Thoreau. And so I read the speech, and as I was reading the speech, I'd look up and I'd make eye contact. A person in the back of the room kept going like this. So by the end of the speech, this was really bothering me. And so I asked him, what's this mean? He goes, "Speak from the heart. You put it on paper, tell us from your heart what you want." That's what this is all about. So if I stumble and I mumble and things like that, this is coming from the heart, because this is exactly the story I like to tell about the journey I took to become an astronaut, because it's a journey that I never thought I would take. I dreamed about it, but certain things happened along the way that really changed me and made a difference in my life, and that's a story I want to tell. One of the very first things we did as astronauts is in classroom, we sat down, and one of the astronauts came in and wrote a really big number on the board. He said, in the history of the human race, we estimate about 108 billion people have lived on the surface of the Earth. And then he wrote a much smaller number. As of today, 560 people have actually flown in space. He said, never forget how fortunate you are to do something so very few people in the history of the world will ever get a chance to do. And it behooves you to share that with others, because a lot of us will never get a chance to do it. And it was a remarkable experience, and that's why it does come from the heart to tell that story. Of the 560, 227 people have actually walked outside the spacecraft and done a spacewalk. So I was kind of curious. I'm the 143rd person, in the history of the human race to do a spacewalk. So, really thrilled. But as an astronaut, people say, "Have you been to the moon?" I didn't go to the moon. Really? You didn't go to the moon? No, I went to space station. In the history of the human race, only 24 people have left the Earth and gone to the moon, and of that, only 12 people actually worked on the surface of the moon. And had a gentleman sat right across the table from me at my interview, and said, why do you want to work for us? What makes you different than all these other people? That's a standard interview question, and I'd never really thought about it. I got a master's degree, I'm a test pilot, I did really well in my squadron. Well, everybody else has done the same thing. What makes me different? I like to tinker, common sense, I work with others. This idea that I build Volkswagens, I rebuild a big deck at my house. I think the space station is the ultimate construction program. I would love to turn a wrench in space. Okay, thank you. And I walked away thinking, stupid answer. Dumb answer. And I sat, the next thing was to sit in a Mylar ball as a claustrophobia test for about 20 minutes thinking, that was the dumbest thing I could have ever said. I get a call in April and get hired. And in one of the very first classes, one of the astronauts came in and said, no, one of the mission control guys came in and said, how many of you guys work in your cars? He said, the space station is a construction program. I want people to know how to do that. I was like, yay, he said the right thing, so, okay. My journey started in Oklahoma. The little kid right there is me. It's my big brother, my great-grandmother, my grandpa. I'm a member of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma. I was considered the first Native American to fly in space, and I take that very seriously. I'm very honored to be in that position. Kind of share my role with kids that never had a person in that position before. I moved around a lot as a kid. My mom and dad were both interested in aviation. This is actually an air show at Peterson Air Force Base back in 1964, I think. Yeah, I'm about five years old there. My dad was actually a pilot, and he taught me how to fly. I got my first flying lesson when I was about 10 years old. I took for granted the fact I got to fly airplanes. I thought everybody got to fly airplanes, right? And it wasn't until much later, not until I was a naval aviator, I actually got my pilot's license. That is my prom picture. 1976. I didn't go to prom. I got the tux, but I'd moved from Texas to Colorado, and the job I had, my boss wouldn't let me off, so the girl asked to prom, got kind of mad at me. My mom said, take a picture. So that's it. I went to college because my parents told me I had to go to college. They knew to improve the chances for success, I needed to get a college education. My mom actually dropped out of high school when she was 15 to raise a family, had my brother when she was 17, had me when she was 20, got her GED in her 20s, and went on to become a registered nurse in her 30s. My dad has a PhD in experience, but he's never been to college. He's very mechanically inclined. That's where I get my common sense mechanical aptitude. I went to college with the idea of being a forest ranger. I like to work outside. When you go to college, you change just a little bit. I tried to grow a mustache back then, too. I spent most of my time, my freshman year of college, I learned how to rock climb. I spent most of my time rock climbing and very little of my time studying. And when you don't study, you don't do well. I earned, well, earn's a bad word. I had 3 Ds, two in biology and 1 in Western civilization, had a 1.72 grade point as a freshman, and I was working full-time, going to school part-time. I got kicked out of school as a freshman in college, University of Colorado. I got suspended my first year. Well, what do you do? What happens after you do something like that? Well, I took my rock climbing experience to the mountains. My job was to hang off of cliffs. This is Interstate 70 in Colorado, right at Colorado River. My job was to hang off these cliffs as a rock climber, and I'd rappel off the side of the cliff and I'd hold a prism against the rock. And guys on the ground would shoot an infrared beam of light to the prism I held in my hand. So since light travels at a constant velocity, if you know the time it took, you could determine the distance. If you knew the angle of the hypotenuse, you can determine sine, cosine, x, y. I learned trigonometry for the very first time in my life on the side of a cliff. And I had seen it in a book, but I'd never had seen it in practice. And I worked with people that did it for a living. And the guy that I worked for sat me down one day and said, what are you going to do when you grow up? I was 19. I lived in the mountains. A room and board was paid. I skied on weekends. It was great. He said, why don't you go back to school, become the engineer, and be the one responsible for an entire project like this? And so I did. So I went back to the university. Actually, I did. And when I was a senior in college, I tutored a guy in calculus who was a retired Navy captain, convinced me to join the Navy. So I did, and they cut all my hair off right there. Shaved it all off. I went on to fly P-3 Orions in the fleet. I hunted Russian submarines for about 4 years. I lived in Alaska, in Adak, Alaska for 2 winters. I lived in the Philippines. Most of my friends went to work for the airlines. I stayed in, went to test pilot school, because that dream I had as a kid, I knew that about half of the people that I'd watched on TV back in the 1960s, about half of those folks have been Navy test pilots. So I went to test pilot school, and I realized there that the plaques of all the graduates were the names of the people I used to watch on TV. So if they could do it, why not me? If you don't apply, you won't become an astronaut. So I applied twice, actually earned a master's degree in aeronautical engineering to be competitive. Applied twice, second application, I sat across from John Young, the commander of Apollo 16, asked me why I wanted to work for him. And I got selected in 1996. Had the best job in the office. I was a mission specialist at NASA, but I still flew the jet, naval aviator, got to fly the jet, got my flight pay. I got to walk in space. They don't let pilot astronauts walk in space on the shuttle because they're considered essential crew, and the rest of us are expendable, so I got to go outside and do that. I'm an artist. I've always drawn stuff. My daughter actually has a degree in art. Hardest part about flying in space is getting 4 people to agree on what the patch looks like. Basically, the 4, whoops, I'm sorry. Go back here one. The 4 of us, Jim Weatherby, Paul Lockhart, myself, Mike Lopez Alegria, we went to the space station and installed this truss, but we took 3 people to space and brought 3 people home. That was our primary mission. And we did it with 4 wonderful people. The commander, Jim Weatherby, Paul, Mike, and myself. There's actually 6 people in this photo. The suits Mike and I are wearing weigh 300 pounds. And NASA, in their safety culture, doesn't want you to get hurt, so they stick a guy behind you to hold you up. The gent right here is Gus Loria. He was our original pilot, but he had a medical issue, couldn't fly with us, and I love the look on my commander's face at me messing around. This is off the launch pad in November of 2002. There's about 7 million pounds of thrust coming out of the mains and the solids, main engines and the solids. All of that energy actually could bounce back up and damage the bottom of the shuttle, so they dump about 300,000 gallons of water onto the launch pad about 16 seconds prior to launch. You can actually feel it. The whole launch pad shakes. Once you get airborne, though, I'm doing about 100 miles an hour by the top of the launch pad right there. We go up and around the Earth. You get to go 17,500 miles an hour. So from liftoff to right about here, 8.5 minutes later, you're doing 17,500 miles an hour. You weigh about 3 times your normal body weight. The computers actually throttle the engines back so that you don't overstress the vehicle. When the engines quit, you go from 3 Gs to 0 Gs instantaneously. And the first thing I did was not look out the window, it was let go of my checklist and watch it float in front of my face. I had never done that before. And now it's, hey, it's floating. And you realize when you take your seatbelt off, you're floating. So now half of your brain is considered, how do I hang on and do my work that I've been not used to having to hang on to something the entire time. This is a great shot. The space station took this photo of us. This is New Zealand. This is the North and South Islands right here. That's called Cook Strait. And James Cook sailed the HMS Endeavour through that strait back in the 1700s. Our spaceship is named after his sailing ship. So if you're wondering why it's Endeavour, O-U-R, that's the reason why. And we took this picture of the space station, and our job was to install a truss right here, identical to this one. You reject all the heat that's made on the space station with these big white panels. We did that with 3 spacewalks. Spent about 20 hours outside the vehicle. Have you ever been in a swimming pool when you dive down and you get that pressure change, and so you grab your nose and you Valsalva, equalize the pressure? In that suit, you go down to about a third of what we have right here, and you breathe 100% oxygen. So as that pressure changes, you can't grab your nose, right? You can't grab your nose and Valsalva. So they give you a little rubber cushion right here. You can see that right there. It's called a Valsalva device, and you put your big nose on it, and you close your mouth, and you blow, and you equalize that pressure. I did not realize till right there that I can blow air out of a tear duct in my eye. And the reason I found out is all that liquid in my body is floating, and the liquid in my sinuses is floating. So when I went like this, it goes, and I shot 3 splotches of stuff on the inside of my helmet that came out of my eye. And my spacewalking partner's laughing his head off at me, and I'm thinking, now what do you do? What do you do in this environment? Do you tell NASA? NASA, I have eye goobers in my helmet. So I decided, well, I have to get outside. They told you the one thing you have to do is get out on time, because there's a big piece of hardware waiting for you with your name on it, and the longer it's there, the colder it gets. So I made a command decision to what? We've had lunch. Not yet, I'm sorry. I slurped it off the inside of my helmet, and the Russian goes, "John, you don't do that, you fog helmet." And the first spacewalk I went out, and I went, and he goes, "Pff." So I had to kind of look around. So I got out on time. This is great. Have you seen the movie Gravity? Interesting movie. This is my tether. It's about 55 feet long. If, for some reason, I come off the space station, I'll float away about 55 feet, and that tether will actually reel you back in. If it breaks, and it's actually designed to break, because if you break the integrity of your suit, all the oxygen leaks out. Bad day. We have a jetpack on my back here, and we actually have a little controller I can deploy and actually fly myself back to space station. And I noticed there's some VR goggles back there, some virtual reality. We practice that at the Johnson Space Center in a VR lab where they take us to the end of the space station at night and kick us off tumbling in 3 axes, and then we have to turn the thing on and fly back to space station. So it was great fun. Let's see what else we have here. This is what you do after you work really hard. That pair of pliers, watch what it does. It swaps its axis of rotation due to an instability, but it swaps back. It'll do that down here, except it keeps falling to the ground. It's a bag of pistachios my kids gave me in my food locker. You can do that down here, except they all fall to the ground. The lady in the maroons, Peggy Whitson, was the chief of the astronaut office. She was a rookie in this flight. Holds the record, I think, for an American in space. No? That's a orange drink, property of a liquid. Surface tension causes liquid to form into a ball, so you can play with it. I'm actually trying to cut it with dental floss. You can blow it around. You don't let it get in the equipment. Highly trained professionals. There we go. And this is a chain that Jim had around his neck, and Valery, the Russian, said, "Put it in a ball of water, watch what it does." So there's air bubble in the middle. You can stick a straw and suck the water out, and the chain still floats. We sleep in sleeping bags. I didn't like the idea of not touching anything when you go to sleep. It's really bizarre. So I'm actually got my head Velcroed to the pillow right there. Peggy slept standing up, and Paco would do a backflip into a sleeping bag. That was my mission. I found another one, STS-132. I just want to show this to show how much fun you can have after you've done all your work. It's Garrett Reisman. He worked for SpaceX until recently. How many want to do that? You get to do that. It's pretty cool. Those are those little licorice fish, Swedish fish, trying to get the fish in water. See, the liquid, and Chris Hadfield talked about this, when you cry, liquid puddles up in your eye. Right? There's no crying in space, but if you did cry, it puddles up on. If you sweat, the liquid sticks to your body and you have to wipe it off. This is just a knob that you spin it really fast, and it's gyroscopically stable. So if you spin something in 0G, and you can actually push it around and with air, in this case. This is a slightly unstable astronaut named Steve Bowen. I think he was a gymnast at the Naval Academy, but I'm not sure. The proper dismount off of the... This is on the middeck of the space shuttle, so you have a lot of room, not just the floor, you have the whole volume to work in. So Tracy Caldwell, Dyson in the gray, Piers Sellers, my classmate. I always wanted to do one finger pull-up. You can do it in space. And the nice thing is you work with people you have a neat relationship with. Curling in space, Canadians. Here we go. Here's my sweeper right here. One of them. Here's my puck. It's called a puck. Is that right? Curling, is it a puck? There you go. They had a great time. I guarantee you one of those M&Ms is still floating up there somewhere. We eat our food, all the canned food is Russian food. You notice a lot of the spoons are really, really long because we also eat meals ready to eat, so you have to stick them down into the bag, and without getting your fingers dirty. And the thing is, it's a lot of camaraderie. And these are Russians. These are people I was trained to fight in the Navy, and I was working with them. It was a fabulous experience for me. And it's Tracy. They love their tea. This is a bag of tea. Just fill it full of water. And then I think Garrett's going to eat a big chunk of food here. Well, I had fun. One of the things that I did to honor my heritage, and my commander said, take 2 things that you value most, and I chose very carefully. The Eagle Feather was presented to me by a gentleman named Phil Lane Sr., and Phil was an elder with the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. His grandfather was actually a survivor of the Battle of Little Bighorn. It's beaded Mother Earth and Father Sky and all the people of the world. The flute was made by a Cherokee friend who was an engineer at the Kennedy Space Center. And he uses math to determine where each of the holes goes based on the length and diameter of the flute. And they're now both in the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. Any ideas where that is? It's China, right there. South Korea, Seoul, South Korea. Something's not happening right there. That's Pyongyang. You can actually see this from space. The lack of infrastructure in space is highly evident when you get up there, and it's pretty eye-watering. Now, I'm not sure. I thought about this long and hard trying to figure out. This is looking up over Canada. About 56 degrees is up here somewhere at the center of the photo. I believe this is Calgary, and so I think that would be Edmonton. Now, I'm not sure. We're talking about this, Grant. I think that's Winnipeg over here, but I'm not quite sure. But it's great to be able to look back and see where you're from. So you're in this picture somewhere. Probably even more so here. I think Chris Hadfield actually took this photo. We are right there. We are here. And one of the neat things about being in space is looking back at where you're from. And I felt really insignificant. I felt really, really small being in space. Let's go back on the space shuttle. This is what books do in 0G. I spent about 2 weeks on the space shuttle, about a week on the space station. I came home and we landed. I never felt so heavy. I felt somebody had taken a bag of potatoes and dropped them on me. I couldn't stand up. I'd take my hat off and I'd throw it on the table and I'd drop it. Or I'd walk around a corner and I'd bump into the wall. I'd lay in bed at night. I get about 45 degrees over and the bed goes and throws you down. And I'd swear that was the floor because I could actually float out of it. And it was a fabulous experience. It took about a week to get used to being back on the Earth. I was commander to 2 Russians on the space station. I was training in Russia for about a year to be the backup commander to another Russian named Pavel Vinogradov. And I was diagnosed with osteoporosis. I got a call from my flight doctor while I was in Russia. I got disqualified from long-duration flight. I came back to the U.S., could have flown on the space shuttle, but the mission after mine was Columbia, and I lost 7 friends on Columbia. 3 were my classmates. I didn't know if I'd ever fly again, so I was offered an opportunity to work for a commercial space company called Rocket Plane, and the idea was to fly paying passengers in space. We had a really neat concept also. We bought a company called Kistler. A rocket was designed by the same guy that designed the Saturn V, a guy named George Miller. We won the same agreement that SpaceX did. You've heard of SpaceX, right? Here's Rocket Plane Kistler? No. We were owned by a millionaire, not a billionaire. We didn't have the $400 million that NASA required to match the money they gave us. And SpaceX has been very successful, and more power to them. I didn't know what I was going to do. I left the company in 2007. I was 50 years old. I thought, well, I'm going to pedal a bike across the country because I always wanted to do that. I decided to talk to students all across the country about my Native American students. I went to Indian reservations and NASA schools to share my story about how I became an astronaut. I called it Rocket Trek. I started at Cape Flattery. I pedaled to Cape Canaveral. Right about here, I pedaled into a little town called Lewiston, Idaho. And the woman that was my host had written a book I bought for my mom back in the 90s. I met that woman 11 years later. It took me 3 days to fall in love, and she did too. I proposed to her here in front of the countdown clock at the Kennedy Space Center. I moved back to Idaho, got married, moved to Idaho, and went back and earned my PhD in education. My wife encouraged me to do that. That fundamentally changed my life. The sad part about that is my wife passed away in April from cancer. I'm sorry, I don't mean to cry about that. But she motivated me, and she said, keep doing what you do. Go out and share the story about becoming an astronaut. You work with Native students, the idea of motivating them to do something that they never thought they could do. And I take that to heart. I do it. And honor her legacy, I'm doing that. This is a real quick video of that bike ride. Any sound to it? Should be. In there somewhere. Anyways, come up out of, there we go. Pedaling into Seattle, up over the Cascades. It's about 110 degrees that day. This is out through the Tri-Cities of Washington State. A lot of weird stuff on the side of the road. This is Lewiston, Idaho. The Nez Perce Reservation. Up into Montana. Lolo Pass. It's the Salish Kootenai tribes in the Flathead Reservation in central Montana. Into Helena. This is actually painted on the side of the road as I pedal into this little teeny canyon. So central Montana, this Japanese gentleman was pedaling from Prudhoe Bay to Tierra del Fuego. I met him, he's eating rice in the middle of Montana. I met a lot of really neat people. Then I pedal up into Crow Agency, Montana. Actually flew a flag for the Crow Nation on my flight as well. I gave it back to him on my bike ride. I lived in Wyoming as a kid. This is right outside of Thermopolis, Wyoming. Up over into Green River and Sweetwater River, central Wyoming. Snake didn't like me. It's outside of Rawlins, Wyoming. This Chinese lawyer was riding across America to write a story about Americans. And this gentleman, Aaron, was going the other way. So I rode with Denny Moo through Colorado. Into Kansas. Kansas is flat. Kind of flat. And into Oklahoma. A lot of tortoises, little turtles in Oklahoma. The Chickasaw Nation, women actually use turtle shells as shackles on their ankles for dancing. This is my tribe going out through Oklahoma into Arkansas. Yeah. Some big rattlesnakes out there, I didn't realize, in the Ozarks. Anything free? Then through into Alabama. I think really neat stuff I found on the side of the road. And then this billboard of Britney Spears, I feel like that with a little microphone right there. Into Florida. And I actually pedaled to a space shuttle launch. I met a young man that pedaled from where I did. Took him to a space shuttle launch at the Kennedy Space Center. Just shy of about 4,200 miles. And it took about 2 months. I say the bike ride did change my life. Earning a PhD and work with Native students. And I'd be happy to, after this, to talk about that hopefully during the Q&A session. You're familiar with Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was an escaped slave, and she actually led a battle for the Union Army, was a nurse. She's going to replace Andrew Jackson on a $20 bill. I'm good. Andrew Jackson kicked my tribe out of the southeastern United States back in the 1800s. I'm good with this. Harriet Tubman. She said this in the 1800s. Every great dream begins with a dreamer. Always remember you have the strength, patience, and passions to reach for the stars and to change the world. So I was very fortunate that I have met people in my career that encouraged me to do something that I didn't think I could possibly do. And I made the tough decisions to do the right thing, and they were hard. And this is not an easy thing to do. But if I hadn't had the right people in my life, I never would have had a chance to do that and share the story with everyone here. That's my story. I'm happy as we sit down. I think we're going to do some Q&A here in a little bit, but thank you so much for letting me share that with you, and I look forward to the questions from Slido. Thank you. Tony? Thanks, sir.
Sit down or stand with better fit?
Sit down's fine.
So we got some great questions asked, but I want to, since I have the microphone, I have a little bit of power, I can ask the first question.
Alrighty.
So I much read in the Chuck Yeager's autobiography talking about when he broke the sound barrier. And he said something like, the faster we got, the smoother the flight. I just let the plane fly, and I heard something we've been dreaming about, the sonic boom. Poked through Jell-O. Grandma could be sitting beside me sipping lemonade. Later, much later, I realized the barriers had always been in our minds, not the sky. And I always use that quote when I talk because these barriers that we face, how did you learn to overcome when people might have tried to pull back on your dreams because they didn't want you to be disappointed?
Well, my parents they always said, hey, you need to go try, go out and do it. I learned to rock climb, and I'd come home from rock climb, and I'd taken a fall once, had a big cut in my back, and my mom's like, why'd you do that? So, well, I always liked that challenge of doing something and the success that came from doing something difficult. So I knew that the hard stuff you do, there's an end to it. And rock climbing was my first experience that gave me, that I learned that I could do something that was difficult. And there was a feeling of satisfaction that came from doing something difficult. So I think when I had a challenge and got kicked out of school early on, is that, well, what's that next thing can I do now? And find something that motivates you and gives you that desire to do something else. And then I found I was good at it. And so the next time you realize that you're good at something, it makes you want to do that next thing. So if a barrier comes up, you realize it's hard, you got to push through it. I would fly P-3 Orions, these big airplanes in Alaska, and I'd do these missions off the Soviet Union. And I'd fly for like 9 hours and come back into a snowstorm and a blizzard and the runway, and you're the one responsible for 12 people on board the airplane, and you land in the snowstorm and you come to a halt and people smack you on the back and say, good job, Mr. Herrington. They don't realize your feet are shaking on the rudder pedals, because it's hard. But that feeling of satisfaction is huge. I think that's the next thing.
How did you go from rock climbing, which to me you found this love of a tightrope and challenging and overcoming obstacles, which is quite a solo sport, to then finding yourself in a world where teamwork is everything?
Navy, being a naval aviator. I mean, that's what you do, is you're responsible with this whole team now. And you have to be good at what you do because everyone else relies on what you do. All the systems I learned, all the things I learned as a naval aviator, working with a team, you can't accomplish your mission without teamwork. You get to NASA, it's the exact same thing. In my PhD, what I realized in talking to the students, I worked with a group of Native kids on the Duck Valley Reservation, and one of the questions I asked was, what motivates you? I want to work with my friends. I want to do collaborative learning. I want to be this experiential type of learning with my friends. That's teamwork, and I was doing it in the Navy, I did it at NASA. That's the way I learned in college. I started off doing it on my own, and I didn't do very well on my own. When I came back the second time, I studied with a bunch of folks that enjoyed the same thing. And so I had this collaborative learning environment that I didn't have when I first started. And that allowed me to do better.
I loved your trigonometry example on the mountain because I failed calculus the first time I tried it. Then I found a teacher that showed me about calculus in something I was interested in.
Yeah.
And it suddenly woke it up because it helped me get to where I want to go. Do you think we can do a better job in the education, given that you're around this now, in finding a way to people to learn with more passion versus really maybe just the way they're learning now?
That's a great question. Another question I asked my students that I studied was, what was the motivator? And that was mommy, sisters, aunties, grandmas. It was a maternal component was the key motivator for them. But this idea of collaborative learning, I asked them, what is it that, how do I say this? Do you have examples of Native Americans as natural scientists or engineers in your curriculum? And they go, no. Well, you start talking Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, the Mound culture, Cahokia, all these places in North America that Native peoples built back, 500 to 1,000 years in the Common Era that, they're prime scientists and engineers. Your ancestors are scientists and engineers. It's not something this is in your DNA. So I try to get the kids to realize that, hey, this is something that's a part of who I am. You have to learn the stuff now, but how did my ancestors do that in the past? One of the things that I thought about, how do you take this into the classroom, not burden the teacher with it, but bring in what maybe is called a cultural toolkit, where I can bring in something to students and say, hey, this is how your ancestors did this. This is the way they made measurements. This is the way they made observations, how they were incredible observers of the world. And give them a chance to study that in that environment and give them that motivation to like, hey, I can do this. And that's a huge question. How do you do that? Not being an educator in the classroom, but doing the research. That's what I want to do, is what motivates kids to go down that path.
So a lot of I'll take this as the last question, then I'll open up to Slido, but a lot of what we're dealing with is negative energy, that the eliminated, obsolete, really very aggressive words. We're talking about humanity, and humanity's purpose is very often attached to their work, practicing the craft. So how do you help this generation come to terms with, yes, the corridors will be populated by AI and technology, but there's still a meaningful role for humans in this world?
Well, a lot of the research that's been done in the Native community is about the deficit model, is that why they're not capable of doing it. Well, the barriers to education, when the reality is a lot of Native people are very successful in what they do, and they've overcome a lot of obstacles to be able to accomplish, in many different professions. Utilize the tools they have available to them in the classroom. You're familiar with Khan Academy. A lot of that's great stuff, but if you don't have an internet connection, you can't do it. So how do you make it available to communities that don't have the connectivity to be able to utilize those resources? That's a huge one. I asked that question at a conference in New York City, that they make DVDs available to where you can get those things distributed. So one of the biggest challenges for a lot of communities in the Native world are not having the connectivity. How do we make those articles available to them so they could utilize the stuff that other folks take for granted?
Fabulous. Some questions obviously in your career, but this one it's kind of fun. NASA or SpaceX, who's doing it better?
SpaceX wouldn't be doing it without NASA. NASA pays SpaceX to do the work they're doing. Now they also have commercial payloads they're flying, which is great, but I think there's about $3.2 billion that NASA paid for SpaceX to fly cargo. And hopefully in the next month or so they'll launch the Dragon capsule, and then some of my friends will hopefully fly on board of that. So commercial space, in the sense that is a commercial entity that built a vehicle, a commercial entity built a space shuttle, a commercial entity built the Saturn V and the Gemini and the Mercury, but it was owned by NASA. NASA now leases that. They'll lease that from Boeing, they'll lease that from SpaceX. I wish SpaceX the greatest success, but it's a tough business. That's a tough business. I hope it's done safely.
When you come to outsourcing and you're working within a culture like NASA, and suddenly SpaceX you're handing the ball off to SpaceX, even if you've always worked with commercial, how do you deal with a culture that has to let go a little bit of their identity and their destiny and turn it over to someone else, and yet still work in a very collaborative way?
Well, one of the challenges for me when I left NASA and went to work in the commercial world, I realized I was working with people now that had profit in mind as their business model. I had come from a culture where profit had nothing to do with it. It was all about the mission. That was a rude awakening for me. It was an absolute shock in some respects, that I was now in an environment where, I'm in the safety culture where, it's about people's lives. But the management may have a different aspect to that, where it comes down to how I'm going to make money at this. Because if they can't make money, and you start killing people in the business, you're not going to make any money. My challenge, as I looked at it from my role, was how do I make this vehicle as safe as possible? And that's what I was focused on. And if I was ever asked to cut corners for safety, I would go find a different business. I wouldn't be able to do that.
So let's bring it back to this ITCAM conference. They had the courage to bring together private sector, public sector, and academic. Let's assume we're all focused on the same desired outcome, which is getting students prepared to find and pursue their path in life. We all know that inherently. Some do it, some have profit as it, some are managing the expectations of voters, citizens, and others are in the academia. How do you get how do you find common denominators so that the three can come together and move the ball forward?
That's a great question. I get asked all the time, how much money do you make? How much money do you make as an astronaut? I tell them, as a government employee, I was probably making about $140,000 a year as a military officer, and they go, oh, $140,000. I have friends that make double that, flying for the airlines. I said, I got a job that I wanted to go to work to every morning. I was excited about going to work, and the money was secondary to me. I tell students this, if this is something you want to do strictly for the money, and you get out there, you don't enjoy what you're doing it for just the money, you're not going to have any fun doing it. So find something that you're passionate about, something you love to do, and if it pays you well, it's great. But you got to go down that path. And so I don't know how you pull all those things together. You want to have an employee that's passionate about what they do because they like doing it. My youngest daughter, bless her heart, wanted to be a cosmetologist. And I said, okay. I said, cosmetology, you're probably going to make minimum wage on average working for somebody else. And she said, I don't care. And I said, you'll care. You'll care. Well, sure enough, she gets her learns how to become a cosmetologist, and she goes, I think I made a mistake. I said, which one was that? No, I'm kidding. She said, I can't, I'm not making what I want to make. And I said, well, start your own business. And she did. She's doing very well. Started her own business, and she's 24 years old, and she's got more clients, and she knows what to do with. So she has a passion for what she does. She's making more money now because she found a way to do that in the skilled trades. And that's a fabulous thing. I think we put too much focus sometimes on this idea of getting a college degree because that's the road to success. Have you ever read the book Matthew Crawford, Soulcraft, Shopcraft is Soulcraft? It's a PhD philosopher, University of Chicago, who's also a motorcycle mechanic. And this idea is that we devalue the skilled trades, and we shouldn't, because you can't outsource your plumbing, you can't outsource your hair, you can't outsource these things. You can make good money doing it. So that in that workforce, we could focus on that as well.
So Dr. Karen Gordon, this is a question that people are talking about academia. When you're not armed with that MBA or university degree, and your self-esteem might suffer because that's what society puts as a tick box as being something special. How do you motivate people to look beyond just their degree to know that they have a role to play?
I came from the University of Colorado Springs, UCCS. It's a small part of the university college system. If you ever said, well, is that person going to become an astronaut? Well, those people say, oh, you didn't go to Harvard, you didn't go to MIT, you didn't go to Caltech. I don't think that matters. I think if you love what you do, if you're good at what you do, and you've done well in your career, that's what employers are looking for, and should be looking for, rather than where that degree came from. If the person is passionate about what they do and is good at what they do, that should be the metric for what would cause me to hire them.
You keep running back to emotion and love what you do. How do we bring more emotion into those three sectors?
Wow. It goes back to the idea of how do you feel about what you do. When you're doing something really hard and it's difficult and you accomplish it, it's that feeling of success. It goes back to this idea is that what I remember most about flying in space is not how beautiful the Earth looks, but how I felt doing what I did, what I was trained to do, and that I did it well. You don't fear dying, you fear making a mistake. Really that's the fear you have. And it's that, if you can put a challenge to a student and they find the success from doing that and they take that on and it motivates them, because they feel they're good at something. I didn't realize I was good at something until I started accomplishing the hard stuff, and that's when I really wanted to do the next thing.
Did you find that out inside, or was that the person on the rock cliff that said, "What are you going to do when you grow up"? Did you need a mentor or a guide or a Yoda?
Yeah, I needed a Yoda. Yeah, I needed somebody that said, that you need to go down. You need to think about doing this. And if I didn't have that, I might have been stuck in that one spot. My view of the world was not always, out 10, 15, 20 years. My view is, what am I going to do now that gets me going every day? And then, oh, by the way, somebody comes along and goes, hey, and gives you a nudge and pushes it that way. And I went, yeah, thank you. As a matter of fact, I called that guy. I called him and told him, thank you very much for what you did for me. And, we don't know what impact we have on...
Did he tell you to bring your rock gear back? Or
no. He goes, that's good. That's great, John, thank you. I was in an elevator in Phoenix, Arizona, and this young lady stops me. She goes, you're Commander Herrington. Yes, I am. And she said, I met you when I was 12 years old. You came to a summer camp at Fort Lewis College. I said, oh yeah, we ran around the track for a mile before we did anything. She goes, yeah. She said, I didn't realize I could be an engineer until I met you. And she says, thank you. She's now an engineer with the city of San Francisco as a hydrologist, a civil engineer. And that was fabulous. I mean, if you can make a difference in the life of somebody, that's a fabulous thing.
Another great question here is, how many careers have you had, and what do you enjoy more, the career or the pivot?
Career
Or the pivot, where you're going down this path and you chase a new path?
You know, my career was naval aviator. I mean, I was an aviator test pilot that led me to the astronaut corps. So that has been my career. I never imagined growing up that I would become a military officer. I lived in a town where there was Army on one side and the Air Force on the other, and I joined the Navy because I met a guy who did something that I admired, that I appreciated his stories, and it led me down that path. The pivot into the commercial world was an eye-opener, a huge eye-opener for me. Going from a military government job to now a for-profit entity that was a private entity that I had no knowledge about what kind of money he had, unfortunately. But it was a different skill set, but I still worked with engineers, and that was the same thing I'd done earlier in my career. And then going back and get my PhD and working with students has been just an absolutely fabulous thing, where I feel like I give back more now than if I sat down as an engineer at a desk, working on designing the next spaceship. I like working with kids that they can do that so they can be the first person on Mars.
I'm really sorry about your wife, because it sounded like she was very transformative to you. How much of what you're doing today is because she too saw something in you in terms of giving back?
Yeah, my wife made a better me. She did. She always looked for that next thing that we could do that would make a difference in somebody's lives. We did some documentaries. I'm working on IMAX film right now. The IMAX folks called me the day after she passed away, and they had no idea she had passed away. And I told them this is what my wife loved to do. She was an educator. She was a journalist. She was very passionate about the Native community. And I said, this is what she loves. So we're going to dedicate it to her. So this will be out in about a year or so. And in February 2020, my wife's birthday was February 20th. So this is fabulous, all these things coming together. That's exactly what she would love for me to do.
So speaking of that love, tell us a little bit what you're doing after you leave this stage, because I understand we're getting good value for your time. You're going over to the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. Tell us a little
Human
bit
Rights. Going to go meet with a bunch of Native kids. I'm going to do another presentation. Also going to sit down and connect video link with about 15 different Native communities all across Canada. And it's a great time. I've done stuff before with Whitehorse in the Yukon, and I've worked with APTN. I've done some stuff for Children's Science Show, Coyotes Wild Science. We've done that. So I get to go out this afternoon and meet with Native kids and share my story and answer their questions and do the very best I can to share my, my career.
How have you adjusted your behavior working with younger people and students, and as opposed to being where you were in charge? I mean, people saluted you and stood up when you walked into rooms and stuff. How do you deal with the new generation that's kind of going? How do you get them to listen and be part of the conversation and know that you have something of value to offer?
Baby boomer, have Gen Y kids, so it's fun to go out and share and be passionate about. It goes back to the idea of passion. I sit down and talk to K through 5, and I'm sing-song. I'm telling the stories that get them kind of motivated and do it in a short period of time. But have fun with them. Show them stuff that goes, I didn't realize we could do that. I take these little Alka-Seltzer rockets, take a little old Fujifilm canisters, have the really tight lid, and I'd tell kids, hey, this is my gas tank, and I'm going to put some stuff in here, liquid and solid, I'm going to make gas, and it's going to pop, and this rocket pops off the ground and goes 20 feet, and the kids are like, yay, this is fabulous. It's to get them something that goes, ask that next question. How'd you do that? And it's a fabulous thing. I love doing it.
So I got a very serious question from here. What do you tell the people that believe there's a flat Earth?
Okay, who did that one?
The beauty of Slido, and I can tell you it was anonymous for a reason. So.
Yeah. I'd say, okay, what data do you have to support that conclusion? It goes back, we need to all be critical thinkers in our lives. A lot of times we take something for granted and go, Well, one of the very best questions I was ever asked was by a 10-year-old. He said, "Why should I believe you?" That's a great question. Why should you believe me? How do the lines of evidence converge on a conclusion you have, and how do you support what that is? And keep asking the questions. If you don't ask the questions and let somebody just feed you something and take it for the gospel, then that's not, you're not doing yourselves any favors. We need to teach critical thinking well before college. We need to have kids be able to sit down and look at logical fallacies and determine when people are telling them something totally out to lunch that it's just not right. And I don't think I didn't take critical thinking until I was in the university. But I think I've done that most of my life. But how do we teach it so that's something walking out the door, that you can evaluate everything that you see out in this world, that people are always telling us stuff that just doesn't make sense.
John Herrington, you called the person that helped you on that rock face, and you thanked him for telling you to go back to school. I just can only imagine how many Native kids are going to call you over the next 20 or 25 years for the work you're doing. Thank you for being with us today, and thank you for what you're going to do this afternoon with those kids.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tony.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.